Yeah. So the question that was asked here had to do, or with sort of historically disenfranchised groups, I think, and sort of how proportional representation could help. And Felix made the point. I make this point often. So sometimes people will have this inherent sort of knee-jerk sense that like, well, it's not representative to have. Let's say you have a bunch of single winner elections, and you're using some centrist favoring system that sort of finds consensus, but it's going to find like the sort of the middle of everybody's general interest or ideology. So that can seem unrepresentative. If you had a city council where every person elected came from a single district, and you have groups of people that are, they're just scattered throughout the, let's say you have a city where that has like a Latin population or Hispanic population, but they're not in one little place where they form a district. So they're distributed throughout the city. And so they can't really elect someone of their choice. And so that doesn't feel representative. But sort of the mathematical argument is that if you use a good voting method that finds consensus, then those voters can still be like a tiebreaker in an election. And so therefore, candidates, even if they're not really like those voters, have a strong incentive to go seek out not just their base like they would under the current system, but every last vote. And so they have this incentive to try to find ways to help, like, it's hard for me to call myself out as being in any kind of minority group, but, given my background, but let's just say like I'm part of the 5% of people who's radical on bike lanes. I just want bike lanes everywhere or something, right? And so maybe the mainstream politicians running for office don't care about that. But if there are two candidates neck and neck, and one of them says, hey, I can go get some votes over here by finding this little demographic and being like, I pledge to build a bunch more bike lanes for you. And, I can probably get that done. Then maybe that can be the differentiator. So they're really trying to fight for every vote. And so they inherently have more incentive to fight for historically marginalized communities. So that's kind of the argument. I think that the point Felix makes is a very good one, that even if you say you have some imaginary, you can elect either, 5 people from this outer ring of public opinion, or the 5 people right in the middle. As long as those 5 points in the ideological spectrum average out to roughly the same position in ideology space, the same sort of center of balance of the whole council, you have to expect that, legislation that gets passed will still be very similar, because you're not fundamentally moving the whole center of public opinion on the council one way or another. But it's sort of, you're getting the benefit, I guess, of having people who will speak up publicly from that pulpit, from that chair on the city council to speak for your interests. So there's not to lessen the argument for proportionality. I think there's a good argument for it. But I think Felix is saying if you have a good voting method, fundamentally, even not having a lot of proportionality, you're still going to get very similar sort of overall, positions on issues. And so maybe even just having even like a small amount of proportionality might be sufficient, because then you also get the anti-gerrymandering effect, which is a really strong benefit of proportional elections. So
yeah, I totally follow that, and I understand that. I think that I guess where I'm coming at it from a theoretical realm is, people wanting to shift voting into the next issue where we talk about equitable impact, right? The idea that if you are going to have a system that is proportional, it's just going to mean, ideally, more and more political fringe ideas get pushed out, and more of that moderate consensus comes into the middle. But the other thing that people don't think about is that also is true for in terms of those ethnic, racial, immigration status divides as well. Because the more and more the Black community gets smaller and smaller in Portland, the more and more that community is just not going to have as much political power. So I do know there's some commissioners who are thinking about in that realm of like, how can we make things a little bit more equitable to where certain marginalized communities that we know about, we feel that need to have that boost in, I guess, not necessarily political power, but I don't know how to put it in English, but get that boost in equitable voting power, similar to how we have the open and accountable elections where you have that 6-to-1 match for candidates who are publicly financed. And so they're trying to figure out what is the way to do that with voting.
Yeah, I think the number one thing is that you want to get enough, to the extent you can lobby for proportional representation, you want to get enough seats elected per district that you get beyond just the major camps but not so much that you get to the fringy things, right? So you could probably then say something like, 3 to 5 seats, maybe closer to like 5, could be like a good place where, with 5 seats, you could essentially, get, as long as you have 1/6 of the vote or more effectively, you are guaranteed a seat. And so at that point, you're getting down to a pretty small, narrow interest group that could be, some underserved group. But ideally, without getting, if you get to hyper small, then you get to like the fringy ideological, views, right?
Oh yeah, of course. And I mean, let's see,
right.
Portland's not going to be out here in these streets having like a seat on the city council that's just meant for a black commissioner. Like they're never going to get to that level.
For what kind of commissioner?
For a black commissioner. Like they're not going to have like, okay, you have commissioner for position 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we have our black commissioner and our Latino commissioner. They're never going to do
right. But I mean,
that design of any seat.
Right. But the point being is like if you had some sufficiently large number of people getting elected proportionally in a district, like even in Portland, you could get like a Proud Boy person because you know what I mean. That's where you got to
you're gonna get enough of a small demographic to get in there. Like that's kind of the double-edged sword of it, right?
Yeah.
The more people you have, the more fortunate it is, but the more fortunate it is, the more you're gonna get fringe. So
yeah. So tune that dial carefully.
Oh yeah, totally.
I'd actually argue it like don't worry about how carefully it is. The politics look bad, right? But if it's the center, the question is how functional, dysfunctional you want to be. Again, the same thing for districts and where you want to draw those districts. The voting method you use, infinitely more important than like how many districts you use or how proportional it's going to be, because like the proportionality, proportionality is very important, and I do think it's worth having it. I'm not a fan of districts at all. I don't think like geographic distinctions are substantial differentiations between people, but that's a personal philosophy. So, but I mean, that's what we can recommend.
I mean, I think for me, I'm just more thinking about it, not necessarily from whether you do districts or not. I'm thinking about it from the rubber meets the road in terms of where we are currently in our political spectrum in Portland, and recognizing that whatever system we do have in play, the setting is not going to be equal for candidates who go for those seats, in terms of like if you have a woman candidate versus a male candidate versus a person of color versus white, and taking that into account when we're talking about what system we choose to move into. That's kind of like where my philosophy realm goes into, is like what voting system and what things that we do create systematically, thinking about the impacts of imperfect human behavior as on it.
If there's any other way that I can say, the interesting thing about it is that I think it's very reasonable that we as humans are very, especially in the current day and age, focus so much on these high-level demographics. But one of the things that's absolutely beautiful about proportional voting methods is that the divisions of the day, it's agnostic to them. And it's agnostic to them in a really good way, in that there might be some things where a lot of people actually have a very same issues, but very different demographics. And it will end up, making sure that those people are represented, even if we divided things on racial or political or socioeconomic lines, not political, because that's by definition what we're separating on, sorry. But like, it makes sure that that's represented in all those dimensions, because literally the method that Clay described very briefly was that, when we conclude the election and now we're trying to figure out the proportionality of it, the person with the most votes gets the first seat. But everyone who voted for that candidate now is obliged by the voting method to take a step back and say, you know what, I've been satisfied a little bit. It's time for everyone else to have their go at the political pie and make sure that they have their representation. And then, everyone who didn't get that vote, gets to have their say. And the people who had already been satisfied, their ballot is now worth half as much. And so they have half the influence. And so this factor of having every group that just votes a specific way take their turn, irrelevant of their demographics or where they are based geographically or their socioeconomic background, I think is a really elegant and beautiful solution to the fears we have about there being demographic representation.
They choose their
especially
own.
especially in St. Louis, we saw that there were a number of candidates who were demographically representative who did not fit the needs of the political representation that was being asked of by that community, and they were considered the front runner, Louis Reed.
Yeah, people are picking their own coalition, so to speak. They're choosing what really matters to them.
I hear that our aspect of it. I'm just talking about like as the commission is, as a charter commission reviews these different.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Voting, they're thinking about those impacts because, there's been studies showing that even a candidate of color can have the same value set and align closely with the community in terms of what they want, but then when they put faces to those descriptions, like the outcome gets a little different. And so that's what I mean by like folks are in the commission thinking about those imperfect human errors that come into play in terms of like whatever voting system we do, we have to think about how that impacts the voter themselves who's doing the voting, and also the elected official who's trying to get elected, and who chooses to run and who doesn't, due to whatever voting system we have.
Yeah, I think one feeling I had was that a lot of this also was sort of driven by politics. Like there's sort of the ideal thing we want to get to, and then there's like, what can we actually get accomplished? And so I think part of this is shaped around this fact that I know some people are going to just push for a certain thing. Like, I don't want proportionality. I just want districts with single winners. And I don't know how common that view is on the commission or whatever, but I heard one commissioner that seemed very, very, focused on that point. And I'm not even saying I'm fanatical about proportional representation. I see pros and cons, and I tried to highlight those sort of pros and cons. But I think that the framework I was trying to put out there was sort of saying like, I don't know if there's any silver bullet for anything, but if you use that mental model for like, how many people win per district, and you try to negotiate over that number as opposed to binary, your thing or my thing, that's just sort of like the political pragmatic way of looking at it. Like there's what's ideal, but then there's just like, what can we actually get this commission to say, yes, we're going to put this on the ballot, and I don't know how fraught those politics are within the commission, or how much agreement there is and which way you guys want to go at this point. So I think a big part of my brain is very focused on the politics of it and what you can get past. And so if you're trying to design like the perfect system, you would look at it in a very different way. There's some incredible nuances you could go into. Like I would talk to you about things like asset voting, which is this super innovative idea that's really interesting and super simple, but doesn't have a lot of political history to it, might not be politically viable. So that's a big constraint, I guess, is what could, people can wrap their heads around and seems plausible.
Oh yeah, they're definitely thinking about that, Clay, for sure. They're definitely thinking about what is possible, because we even see a shift in terms of how people at the very beginning spoke about what they would want to see happen versus now. And I think that it is deeply impacted by what they think is viable to the voters, which is, for me, unfortunate, but that's because I love talking about this stuff, and I would like people to vote the way that they wholeheartedly want to, and not what they think is necessary.
Well, I mean, you can see that conflict in my own presentation, where like I spoke at the conference where star voting was invented, and I had been a big score voting advocate for a long time. And then Mark, who had put that conference together, and we had been talking afterward, was like, because the guys from Fair Vote were there, or Rob Ritchie was, and after he was like, wait, what if we had score voting and then we added a top two runoff to it, so we could sort of counter the objections of the ranked choice voting people, and we'd still get the benefits from score voting. It could be really cool. And I was like, I don't know, so that became its own thing, and it really sucked all the oxygen out of the room for score voting. And now if I could just snap my fingers and put any voting method in place, I really would love to see star voting. I think it's really awesome. But it's like, the more I've been sort of beaten down by what's politically possible. Like I was there, I drove down to Eugene the night they had that vote in Lane County, Oregon for star voting. And I was there, and I was also watching the Fargo initiative for approval voting the same night. I'm in this bar with the star voting people, and just kind of like fingers crossed. And, like approval voting passes by 64%. And then star voting fails like 48% or 46 to 42, like a 4-point margin. It was close,
Yeah,
but it was
very close.
It was close, but it was like, oh, and I told them, I was like, you guys should just go after Eugene. They're like, no, we're going to go after the whole county because we don't want to be pigeonholed as like, we're just this, liberal, Berkeley, California kind of vibe, or Eugene, Oregon. It's just a bunch of progressives and that's all it is. And I'm like, dude, just take the win first, then think about that later. And they're like, no, we're doing the whole county. And then it failed. And I was like, I told you so. I was really sad because I wanted to see them both pass and we could see the experiment take place and find, get more data and see how it all shakes out. And since then, they've just been trying to get that next ballot measure out there. And I love that system. I'm just scared to death that you get some really innovative idea like that out there, and then you become the next Burlington, Vermont, where like they used ranked choice voting for 2 elections, then they got rid of it. And now they've brought it back, and who knows how long that will last. It's like on again, off again. It's just like, that's crazy. And I'm hoping that something just dead simple, but almost as good, like approval voting, will just stick. Like, people will just be like, okay, and there's nothing to complain about here. It's so simple. Like, how can you object to this? Okay, fine. And then maybe that takes America to like a whole new place. And then we're able to, in 10 to 20 years, grapple with these much more sophisticated ideas, because now we're more, more a functioning democracy, and we're more open to these ideas, and we've seen a different way to do things. So, who knows what's possible in the future if we can get this incremental win under, out there. So
yeah.
Anyway.
And I'm just going to remind us on time. It's 5 o'clock. I don't know if y'all have other things to do. I mean, you're talking with me, Commissioner Lewis, and I definitely could talk about this all day and night, as you know, Clay, because we go back and forth.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'm here. I want to be here as much of a resource as I can be. And this is like a gift to me to be able to talk with you both. So, but I also don't want to, obligate you to any longer than you want to stay. But please let us answer any questions that you may have or talk about anything that is on your mind before we run. So, just I'm certainly in no rush to get off the phone with you here. So.
Commissioner Lewis, do you have any final questions? I think I asked all mine that I know that other commissioners would have asked had they been here.
And I appreciate you doing that. You're really good at it. Normally at the end of these things, I'd like to ask experts, if they had a magic wand, what would they do? If they could be prescriptive, if they could envision anything and just bring it into reality. And you started to get at that in these last few minutes here. I'm wondering if you were willing to continue down that path just a little bit more.
Exactly. Yes. So in terms of like single winner reforms, like executive elections, I really do think that star voting is kind of it's just the epitome of what we're ever going to get to. It's just, or like score voting. It's just that, like, as Felix points out, it's like 3% better than approval voting. It feels really cool, but in terms of the statistics and the outcomes, it's like, so it's like, okay, if I had a magic wand, sure, I do it. I'm not worried it's going to get repealed because here's my magic wand. You're never going to repeal it. I would also love to see more experimentation with, there's a thing called asset voting. And so that's where you can imagine that, like, you can vote for candidates and you can check a box if you want to. And if you check that box, the candidate has the right to redistribute your vote. So it's basically a way that you can delegate your vote to the people you believe in as a proxy. It's kind of like a liquid democracy idea. And what that would mean is that it's sort of like a very simple way of doing ranked choice voting or proportional representation, but it gives the people you believe in like negotiating power. So what could happen is there could be, like, let's just say theoretically we have partisan elections and 3 people together are of like the Green Party, and between them they have enough votes to earn a seat, but no one of them has enough. But they can sort of band together and say, like, okay, well, let's figure out which of us is gonna, fill this seat, and you can do like horse trading. You can say, like, look, my constituents really want a universal basic income, or we want this thing, or we want to make a new watershed project come to pass. So I'll give you my votes if you'll do that thing. And so the political power is sort of evenly distributed and not just like wasted or thrown in the trash. But it's also extremely simple because you just vote for a person like you always did. And I think it could be really fascinating what that could lead to. But I mean, we need way more experimentation with it. But it's like, it could probably give you better proportional representation than anything people have talked about, like ranked choice voting or whatever, but all while being just like dead simple. All you do is add up the votes. It's like, here you go, candidate, here are your votes. And you could have it where it's optional whether they can transfer it, in which case you'd say, you have 1,000 transferable votes and you have 500 non-transferable votes. So you can't give those ones away, but the other ones you can, and the voter has control over whether candidates can redistribute their votes. And then the other one that I think is really fascinating is just the idea of sortition. Like, there's a good argument to be made that increasingly when you look at issues like climate change and things that are just like like the analogy I make is like, imagine that you had like a jury. A jury is a process where you take a fairly random sample of the electorate. It's not perfect, but by and large our, you know, justice system in some ways, at least in terms of like I've served on a jury, and it was pretty amazing how people from different walks of life all kind of came together, and we had these drawn out debates about, but what if, you know, and I was really impressed by that. And then we have like Healthy Democracy in Oregon, and they're basically doing these deliberative democracy things where they're not binding, but they act like a jury. You bring all these different people together kind of randomly, and then they, you know, talk about things and end up voting one way or the other. And so I imagine you took that idea of a jury where it's like random and it works pretty well, but then you said, okay, you guys, I know you've got your verdict about whether John is guilty of murdering his wife, but you all have to run for re-election. Yeah, you're going to serve on a jury again in a year, but you have to run for re-election, and people are going to vote whether you get to be a juror again, and you know, all this, and you get power and whatever with that. Oh gosh, well, I thought John was innocent, but now maybe he's guilty because that'll get the base out, you know, like that would be crazy. And so to some extent, that's what we're doing with democracy. Like we're taking this deliberative setting where people could sit there and think and let their conscience be their guide. And we're saying, no, you have to run for office. And it's about like sound bites and all this stuff. And, you know, like there are ideas out there, like people, you know, economists are like, we really need a carbon tax. People, it's for some reason unpopular. People will, you know, say no to it at the ballot, like in Washington. And I think you've all probably experienced this yourselves on a commission where like you go for hours and get into these deep, wonky conversations. And you're like, if we put this on the ballot, there's no way the average voter has like 1/100th of the knowledge that we do, because all they can do is see like endorsements and be like, oh, I guess I'm voting for this because so-and-so said so. And they have to trust you and things like that. And I just think, imagine if you could just put the people making the decisions are forced to like be in this deliberative setting, learn as much as they can about this issue, and vote based on their conscience. It's not going to be forever. It's going to be random. And you're not going to vote based on how that affects your future election prospects. You know, you have a certain time to serve, and then you're going to go on your way and be a regular citizen again. So that's something I just think we need a whole lot more like experimentation with. And I would love it if Portland had like, say we said we're going to give like 6 council seats, and they're just like regular council seats, but they're going to be elected through sortition, just randomly from the community. And you could be anybody. You're not somebody who necessarily is cut out to run for office, to put a campaign together, but you're a person and you've had some experiences in your life. Maybe you've been in foster care, you know, maybe you've been a school teacher or whatever. And I think that could really help bring people into the political discussion who normally would never run under the campaign system. So.
And just to be clear, you were saying that that's called jury selection elections?
No, that's called sortition, like
sortition.
But I'm making the analogy that it's just like a jury, and that it's like random, and you have some of the same benefits, but like, you know, it's just it's kind of, there are some places where people are doing it, like Belgium has a new experiment where they're doing that, and I think Paris has a citizens commission, but they're not, I don't know of any of them that are like fully legally binding, so they can't just like write and pass legislation like a regular legislator could. I don't think we're there yet, but we're getting very close, and I think we should just do it. There should be like some, at least half the seats or some number of seats where it's like, okay, these aren't elected, they're chosen randomly, and it's a citizen's obligation to do this. And
it's kind of interesting because it's kind of like the way in which, not exactly like, but kind of like the way in which we have like the charter commission. You get a group of people who ideally aren't necessarily experts on the charter, but may have experiences from the charter and how the charter is shaped now, to meet together and spend a great amount of time learning just this one topic and this one thing, to then later push for recommendations, policy changes, ideas to then get passed through the legislative body. And the idea there is that, you know, like you're not getting experts per se, but you're getting like I don't want to say a sample size, but you're getting individuals from different areas, walks of life, just really coming together to learn something.
You become an expert because you hear testimony from all these experts, and you debate about it. It's like that's
when you walk in the door, you're not like the expert on this.
No, but I mean, it's amazing how much you could be someone who could, you know, you walk in this door, you've never heard about this issue before, then you see a bunch of people like us coming and showing you charts, and it's like, you now know, you're like an instant expert. You now know more than a lot of people who are in that field, because you've seen testimony from all these people for like a year. And but now think, you know, I don't want to like be antithetical to the idea of democracy, but if we put this on the ballot and everyday people are asked to say yes or no to this thing, and kind of maybe they'll read a paragraph about it in the newspaper or something, or their voter guide. And, you know, would it be better or worse for society if you guys could just make the call as if you were elected officials on the city council and like passing legislation? Like, you know, it's a fair question to ask. Like, maybe empowering you more to actually just make legislation could be helpful. You know.
Would you mind if I jumped in and answered that question as well?
I would love to hear that. I do want to check in with my fellow commissioner, because I got the impression that she was sort of trying to wiggle us
Oh,
out.
no. I was just like reminding people what time it is, because I get lost in these conversations, and then I'd look up and it'd be like 10 p.m. and I'm like, yo, dog, hold up. Anybody else want to know it's 5 o'clock in case you got something else you got to go to?
Well, maybe Felix can get his word in and we'll just call it there or something like that. Yeah.
In that case, yes, please, Felix. I would love to hear.
So I'll like put what Clay said like in some box of like, he's definitely out there on like what I would call the extreme edge of like voting, election science and voting theory. Like like you asked the question of like, if you could do anything, what would you do? Just want you to know, like that's pretty far out there. My practical answer to what I would recommend for Portland and for the commission would be either go proportional approval voting, fully, full for the whole council, for the whole city, no districts, and I would expand the size of the council to something more like 9 or 10, rather than believe it's 5 right now, if I'm looking this up properly. Yeah.
It's 5 right now, and I think for the most part, the commissioners on the charter review have been throwing the number 13 around.
Yeah, right. Somewhere in that domain, right? I feel like 5 is just not really enough if you want to have the proportionality and make sure that there's enough representation. But I wouldn't do 100, where you'll definitely get some Proud Boys in there. So that either full proportionality, or I would go single member districts with approval voting. You now have to worry about how do you draw your districts, which sucks. It really, really sucks. In California, where I live, we have the California Voting Rights Act. And that basically says if you're an at-large city, you have to move to districts, and cities are being sued left, right, and center, and lawyers are making money off of it. And it does very little for representation, just moving to districts. The proportionality is where it makes sense. But a district system using approval voting doesn't get a lot of the, it doesn't get the proportionality concerns that you get if it was just kind of one mega district. But it does mean that everyone is a moderate representing their geographic area, and that can actually make a level of proportionality, making sure that there's a representation for those particular neighborhoods and districts. I also think that those two extremes are very politically viable, right? I think people, especially Portland, can totally get behind proportional representation. I think they'll know what it does and what it means. And I think that, going to districts and then just using approval voting is just dead simple, right? Like everyone will also understand that they can vote yes very easily. If you go, I like Clay's presentation where he's saying like, look, this you don't need to min-max this. You can go for this hybrid model. The problem is now you're debating, well, are we doing 3 of 4 or 4 of 3, right? And that's where I think that a lot of political conversations can break down. But then again, you're 99% of the way there, right? Like that's the difference between star voting and approval voting. They're both great. So don't worry about that at that point. If you did ever want to do something like sortition, I would say have a council of 100. Don't do sortition and then have it be just one, emperor for life. That can get really bad. So make sure that you get a good sample size when you're doing sortition. That's all I'll say.
And there's one other idea to kind of similar to that is you could do a hybrid where you do Oakland has this where they have one at-large winner, and then Seattle has this too, right? Seattle used to have, I think it was 9 just I think it was at-large winners, and so there's an initiative that passed in 2013 where 7 of them became districts, and then there are 2 at-large. So there's that kind of precedent for a mixture of both. Different kind of hybrid.
that would be, if I can wave a magic wand, that would be it. Is that like, you tell me what you think the natural districts are of Portland, right? And then, you know, however many districts that is, great, you have that many. And then you have an equal number representing the city at large. One of the things in San Francisco that we've just been terrorized by is that every district thinks for itself and doesn't think for the city as a whole. And so, you know, you see this all the time where like you cross district lines and suddenly the bike lane ends. And you're like, what the hell, right? And so like districts just push the problem down another level. But if for whatever reason you have to move to districts, you can also include some at large. And I wish, you know, I would love to see San Francisco get some more proportional at large members on it. And I think that that's the best way to get the best of both. Not multi-member districts. You still have like single member districts, but then you have that proportional representation on the other side.
We're working on that one too. That's another project.
I don't think I can thank you gentlemen enough for
Such a pleasure.
your
I
dedication.
mean, I was gonna say Felix brought up that great point about districts, because for me, honestly, I'm not a fan of geographical districts, just because you can't, especially in places where redlining has happened, people are forced to live together due to pricing, not
Mhm.
because of their values. And so geographical districts just don't make much sense. But that's because I live in theory world, so.
Oh my God, I'm such an idiot. I heard Theory World and I was like, where is that district?
Yeah, that would be cool to live in. I would
That would
love
be a
to live
great
there.
district. I
Yeah.
would totally live there.
Yeah. Well, guys, we should probably get out of your hair, but you've been amazing. And I feel like so blessed to have this opportunity. I live in a world where I walk down the street thinking about this stuff while everybody else is like talking about, you know, like movies and culture stuff that, you know, and so to have this opportunity to actually engage in what I live for is super rewarding. And I think Felix feels the same way. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. I was gonna say I didn't own a TV until I got one for free with my phone, so that should tell you something about myself. Like what? What's the real world?
That's too weird for me. I'm sorry.
It explains a lot.
All right, well, gentlemen,
Thank you.
thanks so much. And I know that you have all of our email addresses, but if you need anything, just reach out. We're more than happy to chat. And if I hear any more questions, I'll field them your way in terms of answers that you all could potentially give to commissioners, since not everyone could be here today.
All righty. Cheers. Thanks so much.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Have a great weekend.
You too.